Hello everybody, welcome back. The good news for the moment is that lecture 6 here is going to be quite a short lecture, so I imagine it'll be done in about a half an hour or maybe a bit less. We're going to talk in this one about remnant vegetation, which is becoming far and away the standard situation for vegetation in our landscape. We're going to talk specifically about some options for how we manage these areas to maximise conservation. And again, I want you to keep in mind all the time that conservation, as we're talking about it, is about maximising the amount of biodiversity we're retaining in our landscapes. So as you can imagine, since the coming of man to landscapes, quite often patches of vegetation, and as I'm talking about patches of vegetation, I'm talking about all kinds of things from forests to heathlands right down to grasslands, are becoming increasingly fragmented. By which I mean, rather than being one large contiguous piece, they're quite often broken up into very, very small areas that are separated by landscape areas that have been modified by humans for various reasons, which could be for agriculture, it could be for the development of housing. A very common one is it could just be for the purpose of a road being pushed through the middle of a forest. So have a very careful look here at the pictures I have on the screen. This displays the fragmentation over time of vegetation in a landscape. So this is an area in Western Australia here, and we're going to talk about how it's changed since 1920. So in each of our little 4 landscape pieces, which are a map of the same area, the black colour represents native vegetation. And as you can see in 1920 in this particular part of Western Australia, the vegetation was pretty much continuous through the landscape. There were a few little scattered pieces, but most of it was made up of large contiguous pieces that were joined together. By 1940, with increasing European settlement, lots and lots of this vegetation had been cleared. And what you can see here is not only are the patches smaller, but they're starting to become disconnected from one another, which makes it very, very hard for animals to move through the landscape from one place to another. There have been a lot of studies showing that even just a basic road between 2 patches of forest can drastically reduce the amount of movement of animals such as possums and small native marsupials back and forth between those 2 patches. So by 1940 you can see there's already a lot of fragmentation beginning to happen. By 1960, what we have here is a landscape that's essentially cleared, with a few patches of vegetation left in it, mostly quite small, mostly disconnected. And by 1984, you can see a landscape here that's essentially completely fragmented. There are very, very few patches of any size left at all, and very little connectivity. And if you think back to the lectures I delivered earlier this week, we talked about connectivity between patches of habitat being very, very important for protecting biodiversity. And this kind of fragmentation is a very common story anywhere in the developed world over the last 100 to 250 years. And it's becoming possibly the most important threatening process to biodiversity worldwide, is the loss and fragmentation of habitat. Okie dokie. So much of our native vegetation is now fragmented. This has a wide range of detrimental effects on many, many native species. So the bulk of this lecture, as short as it's going to be, is going to be about what approaches are possible to us to address the issues associated with fragmentation in a conservation sense. So what we need to do is kind of take a strategic view of things here. So we're going to talk about some of the strategic things we can actually do. So let's take a look at the illustration on the right hand side of the screen here. And again we have a schematic representing a fragmented landscape. So we have several different patches of native vegetation habitat shown here in the green, but they're mostly small in the landscape. There's only one really significantly large one, and the small ones tend to be disconnected from each other by different amounts of distance. So as we're going through this, I want you to keep in mind the principles we talked about earlier in the week about reserve design that spring from the MacArthur and Wilson equilibrium theory of island biogeography that we talked about. So here we have these separate patches. We have a fence line running straight down here through the middle of it all, and a separate fence line running across from there. So what can we do to make this a better landscape for conserving biodiversity? In between our patches, we have what we'll call matrix, or an area that's been modified or cleared by humans. It's not particularly suitable habitat for a lot of our species. That might well be just cleared areas for agriculture, it might be housing developments, it could be anything. So, the things that we can do in general: expand the area of suitable habitat we have in our landscape. And by suitable habitat we're talking about our native vegetation patches here, the green bits. So we can expand the area of those. We can enhance the quality of the bits that we still have. Maybe these particular patches are not as good as they could be. We can try and improve each individual one. Thirdly, we can try and reduce impacts from the surrounding environment. And fourthly, we can increase connectivity in our landscape. So all of these things relate back to our earlier lecture on reserve design in many ways. And we're going to talk through each of these little pieces one at a time as we go. So idea one, we could expand our area of suitable habitat. At the moment we have a certain given area, right? Which would be all of the size of, or area of all of these green patches added together. There may be ways that we can maximise the amount of green native vegetation here we have, while still minimising the amount of work we have to do. That's important because time and funding, and particularly the ability to develop pieces of landscape, are always going to be very, very limited. So the first step here would be we can start by controlling further clearing. We can stop people taking away anything more than already is gone. That's an important first step, and one that often gets overlooked. The second thing we can do is establish more reserves. So we can take the remaining habitat areas we have and we can protect them. That becomes important as a part of controlling further clearing, because once we establish these areas as reserves, it's much, much harder for development to encroach upon them. It also gives us a legal basis for things like preventing hunting or development in or around these areas. The next thing we need to do is to think about our conservation outside of reserves. And remember, I talked earlier in the semester about the fact that a lot of conservation now has to occur outside reserve areas. So even the areas there that are not officially established as reserves, we can find as many ways as we can to preserve them, prevent them from being further developed and further cleared. Fourthly, we can start restoration and regeneration programs to develop more vegetation. So we had a cleared area here inside of our reserve. We could spend some money on a revegetation program to fix that little area. We could revegetate areas around the habitat we've already got. Those little thin swathes there, just developing a thin swathe on either side, or on each side of our little surrounded area, can increase its area quite considerably for fairly small investments quite often. And we can establish new areas there. So for instance, there was an area that wasn't being used for anything that we could obtain cheaply, and we could find some funding, we could take that area and revegetate that area. Now obviously, based on our discussion about reserve design the other day, the important parts for us are going to be the majorly large remnants. So those are the ones we're going to start with. Those are going to be our primary goals. However, don't neglect the small stuff. Deal with the big stuff first, but don't assume the small stuff is no use or unimportant, because as we're going to show you very shortly, it's not. So this brings us to our second step, which is enhancing the habitat quality and managing populations within remnants. So this is where scientists become involved, ecologists and conservation managers, who are going to make decisions about what we can do in those areas to improve the habitat quality. So we're going to start by managing resource harvesting, which with vegetation will be looking at how much of these areas are being removed for wood or for other purposes, and deciding whether or not that's appropriate. Some things might actually be beneficial. If some of our bigger patches are, say, choked with dead wood, we might actually want all that dead wood removed, in which case we can take that step and possibly use the money raised from doing that to put towards more conservation efforts. On the other hand, if we decide that fallen timber is very important for things like lizards and bird species living in the area, maybe we want to protect that and prevent people from removing it. So that again is where a reserve comes in very, very handy. Everything is always contextual. You need to think about things in terms of the larger strategic plan. The next thing we would always do at this point is look at what threatened species are in an area, and then take steps as much as we can to protect those. So again, a primary step at this point, if we could manage it, would be to have the government declare those areas a reserve to protect those threatened species. At the very, very least, we would undertake education programs in the area to let people be aware of these threatened species and how to look after them better. We'd do our best to control degrading processes. So if these remnant vegetation patches were in the middle of stuff that's been cleared for, say, cow paddocks, we might want to include more fencing to fence cows out of these remnant vegetation areas, because otherwise they'll go in there and they'll eat the green undergrowth and they'll trample plants, and they can do a lot of damage. We would also, though, need to look outside of these patches again, and maybe there are large trees in the landscape in the middle of this cleared area that aren't showing. Maybe there's just a couple of single large trees here. Those things can be very, very important to protect as well. They can be very valuable. They've been there for a long time. They should certainly form an important part of anything we would want to save in a landscape. This would also be the stage where we take any steps we can to facilitate vegetation regeneration. So, planting programs, volunteer initiatives, anything can be really good. So again, here's a great example of a vegetation regeneration program. We could replant a swathe outside these several patches here on the lower right, which I'm circling with my mouse, which I hope is visible on your screen. So simply by including that little area of revegetation, we're linking all of these patches, smaller patches here, together into one large patch, which increases the value of those small patches greatly. And if there were large trees in between those areas, it would be wise to include those as well. We could add fencing to keep animals out. So in this particular instance, we could fence around our newly revegetated area, because a lot of animals like cows and sheep would love to move into newly revegetated area and eat all that young green growth. We could fence the other side of our newly regenerated area here. Again, we could add a fence around our newly regenerated area at the top on the left. So that's our second option, or the second stage of our strategy. The third stage is to try and reduce impacts from the surrounding environment. So if you think about this, each one of these patches of remnant vegetation is surrounded on all sides by a habitat that's very, very different. It might be cleared fields for cows, it might be a housing development with streets and concrete all around it. We don't want that external area intruding into and impacting our remnant vegetation. So we may have to take steps to deal with that, and there's a whole bunch of things we could do here depending on what the problems are. So if we have pest species, maybe we have feral cats or foxes getting into these areas and killing many of the species in here, we could put down baits for them. Maybe we have weeds, invasive species of plant that are moving into these areas from the areas around. And this is very, very common in areas where we have roads running beside these areas, running beside patches of remnant vegetation, because cars will actually transport weed seeds and deposit them along the edges of the roads. And they will then grow into our patches of remnant vegetation. So maybe we need to look at controlling those little side zones, weeding the areas, spraying them occasionally just to keep that source of invasive plants down. Maybe there's pollution running off across hard surfaces where we have lots of concrete and asphalt. Water runs across those surfaces and can carry pollution very easily. So if that's getting carried into our patches of remnant vegetation, we want to take steps to ensure drainage away from those areas. And we also need to worry about wider landscape processes. So what's our hydrological regime like? Is it very, very dry in this area? Is it very rainy in this area? That will change how we would deal with the specific external issues that we're talking about on a smaller scale. We also need to think about land use. So, for instance, say we have a patch of land that's being used there for something particular. And it could be anything. Maybe that's a new cattle farm going in. Maybe it's a recreational area. We would need to think about how that's going to impact our remnant vegetation patches and make sure appropriate protective steps are taken. So it's all about thinking ahead, which is not something humans do, but it becomes important in this context. In that particular situation, maybe what we would try to do is to minimise the area of that land use so that it's not actually overlapping and affecting any of our patches of remnant vegetation directly. And last but not least, we can strongly talk about increasing the connectivity in the landscape. So this again comes straight out of our previous lectures on island biogeography theory and on good reserve design. So, things we can do to increase connectivity. We talked a lot about corridors in that lecture. So we could establish links between our remnant patches of vegetation to allow animals to move back and forth, and possibly even to allow the propagules of different plant species to move back and forth more easily, without having to cross this potentially hostile white matrix area out here. Now, of course, you have to worry about this all the time, because maybe what you're doing if you put in corridors is to increase the connectivity and allow the spread of invasive species and diseases. So it always needs monitoring and careful planning. But ideally, we can create links between these larger remnants. So in this particular case, if we have a look at the top here, We can have vegetation added between these little tiny fragments at the top here and make them part of an integrated corridor between our two larger patches, which allows connectivity between the two large patches and increases the survivability of both. We can add riparian vegetation, which is vegetation along the sides of streams. So in this particular case, as they've done at the bottom here, alongside the stream, riparian vegetation has a huge effect on streams. It prevents bank erosion, which helps keep the water clear. It helps keep the streams deep, which keeps the water cool. And all of those things are important to animals and invertebrates that live in the stream itself. So if we protect the bankside, if we add bankside vegetation to streams, we protect the banks from erosion. We then protect everything that's living in the stream from the effects of that, such as siltation, water shallowing, water temperature rise. So just a little bit of vegetation along the sides of banks, very, very important. We can close up existing little gaps between patches. So we could add some revegetation in this little area between these two patches here. And again, that increases the connectivity in our landscape and makes that into one much larger patch overall. Same thing here, we could add a bit of revegetation to build a new corridor here which links all of these parts. So, here's an overall view. Using the 4 steps we just looked at, we've gone from the picture on the left here to the picture on the right. And if you think about the reserve design principles we talked about, I'm sure you can see why this is a much, much better, healthier landscape. I would have tended to add another little patch in just here at the bottom left to link those two. I think that would have been a good idea. And possibly even another little patch in there to link those. But I'm sure if you look at this carefully, you can come up with some very, very small steps you can take that would have a big effect on the success of our remnant vegetation patches here. So this is a common picture in rural settings out in the country. So here we have a typical aerial shot of an Australian rural setting with patches of remnant vegetation surrounded by human modified areas that act as barriers to dispersal for animals and plant species, separating them. Now this one is not as fragmented as many, but you can still see clear fragmentation into little patches in this landscape. But this is not only important out in the rural landscape in the country, it's also important in the suburbs and in the urban areas. Now there are many things we can do. So here you can see some people replanting riparian vegetation along the banks of a stream. There's still some good trees along the edge of this, but the more vegetation they add here, the more it protects the stream from effects of land clearance. They can add fencing as well, which keeps the cattle and stock away from the rivers, because cattle will tend to trample down banks and cause a lot of bank erosion. Here we have the establishment of a connective corridor between patches of habitat. So you can see people planting trees in this little connective strip, which will be a corridor. And in our landscape we could try and improve connectivity as well. So here we have people again planting trees in little patches, which can act as a stepping stone style corridor to link larger patches of vegetation together. But these things still apply in urban areas as well in our cities. So we can take all of these same approaches. We can expand, we can enhance, we can reduce the impact, and we can increase connectivity. And that becomes increasingly important around cities because they're a very, very fragmented area. Now, here we have an aerial photo of Sydney, or an area just north of Sydney, called Chatswood. So this is about 20 kilometres north of Sydney. And as you can see, there's a lot of very heavily built up areas here on the right hand side of your screen. and then some built-up areas on the left side of the screen. In between, you can see a lot of patches of native remnant vegetation. These have remained here, largely because they're not particularly good areas for housing developments, to be honest. So they tend to be either in very steep valleys or on ridge lines, and just not particularly ideal to build a house, which is why they exist. But they wind up being very isolated from one another in many ways. So in this particular case, we have a nice patch of vegetation here, and a nice patch of vegetation on the other side of the river. But those two patches are separated by the river. So some kind of way of connecting those would be a great little option. So keep thinking about all of these things. Where could we, with minimal impact on what's already done, expand our overall area? In this particular case, Chatswood is very densely populated, so it's quite hard. But there are areas there, if you think about what we could do, I'm sure you can see a few things. In particular, things like golf clubs here take up a huge amount of land. So that's something that you could easily think about working with. Here we have North Sydney, where, not surprisingly, the ACU North Sydney campus is. The ACU North Sydney campus would be here. So this little area just in here would be the ACU North Sydney campus. So we're looking at the area around that, very heavily urbanised, as you would imagine. The Sydney Harbour Bridge comes in just here from Sydney itself. So a very heavily urbanised area. But even here, this close to the Sydney, it's not completely urbanised. We do have some patches of remnant vegetation. So we have Ball's Head here, which is still quite heavily vegetated. We have the Berry Island Reserve, again quite heavily vegetated. And we have some little areas that come up with the two local creeks, where there's still some patches of native remnant vegetation. But again, have a think about things we could do here to improve the situation we've talked about. Take a few minutes, think about the options we've already talked about. What in this area would you expand or enhance? What could you do to reduce the impact? Is there a way we could increase connectivity between these places? In this sort of area where it's already developed, it's quite hard to do. But there are, I'm sure if you think about it, a few little options that you could manage. It's much, much easier to get in at the stage where these areas are being developed and plan this stuff ahead of time than have to come back and retrofit later. Now then, another particularly interesting thing is that if we come down to the bottom part right of our map here, the Sydney Harbour Bridge leaves from the bottom right of our map and heads across to Sydney. Oh, actually, I shall come back to this one in a second. I'll talk about it. So this is the North Head Harbour. So this is a major suburb in Sydney is just above this, which is Manly. It's a beachside suburb. That's the ocean there. Inside here is Sydney Harbour. As you can see, there's a lovely big remnant area of vegetation on the headland itself. But it's very isolated. It's entirely cut off from virtually anything else. So have a think to yourself, is this a good design? Is this a bad design? Why is this remnant vegetation here? But if we come across the Harbour Bridge from North Sydney, it comes in here onto the Carl Expressway. This is Circular Quay where all of the ferries leave from. And this is the Sydney CBD itself. So, this area here, sort of top centre of the screen, this area is the Sydney Royal Botanic Gardens. So this is a patch of basically remnant vegetation sitting in the middle of an incredibly heavily urbanised part of Sydney. But overall it's quite small. I want you to again think of this area here. What could we do with this? Is this a good design? Is this a bad design? Immediately above it are another series of parks. So there's a large state park just in here by St Mary's Cathedral. Then there's Hyde Park up here, which is towards the centre of the city. And those parks are separated by major roads. Are there things we could do there to improve the connectivity of these areas? If we could find a way to integrate these things better, we would have one large contiguous area, which would actually be much, much better for the whole preservation of biodiversity in the city. So these little areas can form really important remnants for biodiversity in our urbanised areas. But even there, we don't have to just settle for what we've got. We can look for ways to make them better. And again, we apply our same strategic principles. Can we expand these areas? Can we do things to make them better? Can we do things to make sure that what's around them is impacting them less? And can we increase connectivity between them somehow? So always bear in mind those principles, and it's again based around that whole theory of island biogeography that I've already talked about. Now, you will find during the prac next week, when you go off to look at the Royal Botanic Gardens in either Sydney or Melbourne, that there are many, many things that are being done there, but what we want you to do is think what more can be done. So there will be questions that you'll be asked about these things in those areas. So I want you to always consider these options here. Be creative, be bold, come up with brilliant solutions. You never know, we might actually be able to convince somebody in power to take up some of your ideas. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this quite short lecture. Very simple principles involved, but I want you to start getting into your head the idea that patches of remnant vegetation are important for biodiversity. And I want you to start looking at the landscape around you, thinking of ways we can make them better. You never know when questions like this will crop up either in a prac or in an exam, so it's worth keeping these things in mind. Have a great week, and I will see you all on Monday. Thanks.